Hi, we're the education team here at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, and we thought we'd have a little conversation for you today related to Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act. I'm Erin Adams, the director. 𝘙𝘯𝘥𝘪𝘢 is our schools coordinator. 𝘙𝘯𝘏, you and I have both had a chance to teach Indian removal to a lot of different audiences, adults and children. What has stood out to you over time about the questions that visitors often bring to the subject of Indian removal?
I think a lot of visitors want to know about, like, how is Jackson coming into the presidency? What kind of reputation does he have? What are people expecting out of him when it comes to Indian removal?
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people come at it too with this idea that Jackson must come with a lot of fury or a lot of anger towards Native Americans or a lot of hatred towards Native Americans, because why would you do this otherwise? And that doesn't seem to really be the case. His reasoning for it is really calmly structured, you know? It's what always stands out to me in that list, because, you know, he does like one comment and then a sentence, two comment and a sentence. I mean, he might as well bullet pointed it for us. You know, one of the things he says that always catches my attention is that it will help them preserve their own heritage and traditions. Is that one that you feel like you hear students kind of stumble with sometimes? Or
yeah, there's always this question about, like, well, what does Jackson know about their heritage and tradition?
Right.
So it's always a big stumbling block for students.
Yeah, and especially when you combine that with the idea that Jackson brings this idea of paternalism to the American presidency, that he is the nation's father, right? Then just like a father has to make decisions for children, he thinks he has that right to make the decision for us and Native Americans as well. So it gets really complicated.
He thinks he knows what's in everybody's best interest, but he's not often in the habit of asking.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think one of the other challenges that visitors may have coming into the topic too is understanding that Andrew Jackson is nothing if not objective driven, right? Like, what if the objective is that's what Jackson is going to focus on, and he is going to meet it. You see that in the Creek War and the brutality against the Creek Nation. The harder you go in, the more fully you demonstrate that you have met your objective. And so understanding Jackson's, or the United States, objective behind the Indian Removal Act, I think, is key to the whole thing. And that's a little hard to swallow for visitors sometimes, because it's an objective that we automatically sort of resist, but that's what Jackson felt was the thing to do.
And there is a fair amount of resistance to Jackson's actions, both in the Creek War, but also when it comes to the Indian Removal Act. Can you talk a bit about, like, what some of that looks like?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to see how much resistance there really is to the Indian Removal Act is to look at the votes in Congress. You know, the Senate approves Indian Removal Act by 9 votes, 28 yeses to 19 noes. And that suggests to me that the Senate, there's some people who have strong feelings about it, but the voices in support of Indian removal are overwhelmingly in favor of Indian removal. But when you look at the House of Representatives, you know, that passes in the House 102 approvals to 97 noes. And that tells me they were fighting it to the bitter end. And not everybody who resisted Indian removal was doing it on the moral high ground. Some people resist it because of the means that Jackson is proposing, or the methods by which this will happen, or the amount of money that the government will spend to make this happen. So they have reasons to object to it that don't have anything to do with the treatment of human beings. But there are people, some of the names that really stand out to me are like Davy Crockett, and our fellow Tennessean, and Theodore Frelinghuysen, who was a senator from New Jersey. And they make it a point to show how this is not an America's character. They're trying to really speak to that insistence that Jackson has, that we're doing this because this is our national character, right, and our national interest. I love the example of Catherine Beecher, right, and what she's doing with the women of the United States. This idea that women have a voice, whether we have political agency or not, we have a voice and we can share it anyway. So like the letter writing campaigns that women are doing, appeals in newspapers across the nation, appeals directly to their congressional representatives. So the women of the nation are really trying to do some of that heavy lifting on the morality, if you will, behind whether or not Native peoples should be removed.
And I think too, people forget that it's still active law in the United States.
Yes.
The legacy it continues to this day to be present in the legal system.
Yeah.
I know you've done some research on like some Supreme Court cases and kind of what that legal battleground has looked like.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, for years, like the Indian Removal Act was the foundational legislation for basically everything that comes afterwards. So the reservation systems and then how those break down for the allotment systems, it's part of what Abraham Lincoln is going to use when he passes the Homestead Act. This idea that the interests of the United States supersede any sort of treaty or arrangements we've already made with Native nations. Right, those articles in the New York Times in like the 19-teens that as soon as natural gas and oil is discovered in Oklahoma and Texas, can we move Native peoples again? And they didn't, but the legal foundation was there for them to do that had they decided that was what they wanted to do. The fact that in the 2020s, we've had at least 2 Supreme Court cases that have invoked the Indian Removal Act. So it seems like such an ancient thing, right? And that we would never stand for this in the United States today. But Congress has the power to repeal any law that the United States follows. Why haven't they repealed this one? And I think sometimes it's probably a combination of, one, it's a tool that the federal government has, and you're not necessarily going to surrender the tools that you've worked hard to put in your toolbox. But also, I think people forget about it. And I think we just keep forgetting about it. So that's part of the issue too. The more I think people are educated about and remember the Indian Removal Act, maybe the more movement we would see in advocating for its repeal or finding some other way to offset the impact of that one law. Has that been your experience with kids too, or what?
Yeah, they're shocked to know that it's still active law. And they're not always versed in what those outcomes have been. So it's been really important to bring that to the present day. Like Indian removal as federal policy is not limited to Jackson's presidency. It is something that has well past Jackson. And it's been something that every president since then has had to grapple with, even to today.
One of the things that most visitors come at us with is they have some understanding that Andrew Jackson is involved in what is called the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is not the same thing as the Indian Removal Act. How have you talked with people about the difference in those two things? And do you think there's one that's more important for Jackson's legacy than the other?
It's all part of Jackson's legacy, but the thing that Jackson has the biggest hand in is the signing of the Indian Removal Act, which I talk about as the sort of final nail in the coffin when it comes to Indian removal. We talk about the Trail of Tears as an important part of that legacy, in that it's the specific experience of the Cherokee people. It's one that's very well documented, given that we're here in Tennessee. It's a local story, so it's a really critical part to talk about, but it is largely happening after Jackson's presidency.
Yeah, I agree with that. The Trail of Tears is awful, right? It's a humanitarian crisis of unreasonable proportions. And every Native nation that goes on this removal journey has a very similar experience. So
the Potawatomi
right,
Trail of Death.
Right, the Shawnee, And so if they, it sort of sets an example of how these removals can be conducted. If nobody's complaining too much about these Cherokee people that are suffering so greatly, it just sort of, it's one more barrier down, right? Like, well, if nobody fought too hard when everybody was getting sick and being imprisoned, then we don't have to worry about that too much with other removals, right? And so it sets a pattern that's really unfortunate. But again, I always go back to the fact that the Indian Removal Act sits at the bottom of all of that. It's what makes all of that possible.
It applies to every Native person in the United States.
Right. It was, yes, absolutely. It was meant to put all of Native America on notice that this was going to happen, and it could happen the easy or the hard way, but it was going to happen. And so when I think about Andrew Jackson and I think about the legacy of Indian removal, I think that's really important for us to do with visitors, is to help them understand that, yes, he has responsibility for the Trail of Tears. And yes, that is a really, really sad and chapter that's worth grieving over. But that alone is different than being the person who sets into motion all the legal framework for that makes it acceptable in the eyes of the law to do so.